Well, welcome to our 1 o'clock panel, the authors from the past. I feel completely out of sorts here with my modern dress. I should have worn my other clothes. But I was going to wear this morning, but I did not wear them, so I just chose this thing. So I feel a little out of place, but that's okay. So who we have here today, authors from the past, we have Hart Lovelace, as everyone's, I think, beloved Mankato author. And I have to confess to you, Maud, I grew up 30 miles away in Waseca, Minnesota, and I honestly had not heard of you until I moved to Mankato. I think it was a very odd thing, and I moved to Mankato, and I love to read, but I was reading Laura, and I was reading Laura. I was reading the Nancy Drew books, so I will make that confession to you. But I'm glad to have known you now.
Read them now since we've been in Mankato?
Maybe. I feel like I don't need to read them. I hear all about them, and I know the stories. It's this Betsy person, this Tacey person, and I think there's a bit or a tib or something. Yeah. All right, and Sinclair Lewis. I had heard of you, Sinclair. Sinclair Lewis, Minnesota author, Sauk Center, and Sinclair wrote part of Main Street right here in Mankato. So you can go down Broad Street, 315 Broad Street, I believe, South Broad Street, and see the plaque where Sinclair Lewis was writing part of his book there. So welcome, Sinclair. Wanda, hi Wanda. Wanda, I did know of you when I was growing up in elementary school in Waseca. So somehow we knew about New Ulm and we knew about Waseca, but we didn't know anything about Mankato. It was kind of the gray area when I was growing up in Waseca. So welcome to the panel, and we look forward to hearing from you. And F. Scott, can you understand me here? Are you okay? Yeah, that's a good point. We always worry a little bit about F. Scott Fitzgerald here, best known for growing up in St. Paul and then leaving us to find more fancy people. I don't know what he was thinking, but that's what he decided to do. And Laura, I have to say, Laura Ingalls Wilder. Yep, I was reading your stuff from a very young age. Yes, so welcome to the panel here. So I have some questions for the panelists, and we'll start here with Maud. Welcome back to Mankato. And I would just like to ask you, which I think people probably have this question of you quite a bit, what are your favorite memories of growing up in Mankato?
Oh yes, take the microphone. Well, it's really difficult for me to share memories of Mankato without being repetitive because my memories of Mankato are in almost every book that I've ever written or that I had a share in writing. So the frankest borrowing of my memories do come in the Betsy Tacey series. For these books are based on my childhood memories from my youth. They are highly fictionalized, of course, and while some of the characters that are in the books are real people and they do know that they're in between the covers of my books, some of them are made up as well, but nevertheless, the Deep Valley of the Betsy Tacey books is based on Mankato. And I lived in many other places. I lived in Mankato, of course, but also in Minneapolis, but no place feels like home to me like Mankato does. I love Mankato and I love the people here, so I can't imagine a more wonderful place than Mankato for a child to grow up in. And I was honored to be invited as the guest to the Betsy Tacey Days in 1961. I was invited by the Mankato branch of the American Association of University Women, and the event brought together many of my childhood friends, so people I hadn't seen in a very long time and people who are even featured in the Betsy Tacey books.
Thank you. That microphone thingy, since I have so few things to say, I just have these questions to ask. But Sinclair, since we do want to know a little bit more about Main Street, since part of it was written here in Mankato, just tell us a little bit more about that novel.
Yes, of course. Well, the idea for a novel of a small Midwest town came to me years before I actually began writing it, although I suspect it was always up here. Village life was all that I had known for the first 17 years of my life living here. But sooner or later, writers do deal with their origins. My novel was set in Gopher Prairie, which is a fictionized town for my hometown, Sauk Center. I shall never shed the little Sauk centricities that enabled me to write it. I was working on Main Street when I moved to Mankato the summer of 1919. I stayed in the residence of friends, J.W. Schmidt family, who lived on South Main Street. And I rented a room in the back of a photographer's studio on Main Street of Mankato to work on the novel. It was released in October of 1920, and it sold 180,000 copies in just the first 6 months. Reports have it that 2 million Americans read Main Street before my next book, Babbitt, was published. I'd just like to say that writers kid themselves about themselves and others, and take, for instance, the writing method. Writing is, simply put, just work. So whether you dictate your writing, you write with a pen, or you type, or even write with your toes, it is still just work. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinclair. So the next question is for Wanda, and we do have all of these authors have ties to Minnesota, and we're in Minnesota right now, and most of us probably grew up in Minnesota. So I think a common question for writers that grew up in Minnesota, and for you, Wanda, how do you think your small town Minnesota roots influenced you as an artist?
Well, I believe that I grew up in a household of old world traditions and legends, Bohemian and Bavarian folk songs, German fairy tales. So it was very important in my household that we were always telling stories, writing stories, reading stories, and we were also always illustrating. My father was an artist as well, very broad-minded, which is where I got a lot of my influence. And I found myself as a child always writing and always illustrating, mostly children, animals, and small landscape scenes. I think that looking back, I realized that most of my influences came from growing up in that house on Washington Street in New Ulm. That's the end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And F. Scott, we know that you spent a lot of time hanging around the very wealthy society people. What did you learn from hanging around those people who were so very rich?
I was wondering when my past was going to come back to haunt me. Yes, it's true that Zelda and I loved a lavish party thrown by the wealthy. We made it look good. We thought we were wealthy. We rented a modest house in Great Neck, Long Island. That was back in 1922. Oh, and we were surrounded by lots of wealthy people. The Guggenheims, the Astors, the Vanderbilts. Champagne flowed. We splashed around in the pools, played tennis on the lawn. But I knew I never really belonged. Ever since my days in St. Paul, where I attended the elite St. Paul Academy, well, I always felt like a poor boy in a rich man's world. I did go to the best schools and went to dance class, attended all the right parties and all the right mansions, but my dad was still a failure in business, and my mother's family provided us some money on which to support ourselves. But I've never been able to forgive the rich for just being rich. And if you are an avid reader of my works, you can see it is colored to all of them. You see, what I learned was that wealth is just a surface quality. It can afford you the nicest houses, the fanciest cars, the most expensive champagne, but does it really help you become a better person? I think I saw for myself how it can be fleeting, if it's not something you've always grown up with. It might be money that and wealth that go back several generations that might be a little more stable. I, on the other hand, didn't have money growing up. And so after my writing success earned me money, I couldn't keep it. I didn't know what to do with it. My tastes began to become more lavish and soon fleeted away on fancy parties and thinking that I would have this wealth forever. You know, I think something I wrote in my 1925 short story, Rich Boy, can shed a little more light on this. Let me tell you about the very rich. They are different from you and me. They possess and enjoy early, and then it does something to them. Makes them soft where we are hard, and cynical where we are trustful, in ways that, unless you were born rich, is very difficult to understand. They think deep in their hearts that they are better than we are because we had to discover the compensations and refuges of life for ourselves. Even when they enter deep into our own world or sink below us, they still maintain that they are better than we are. They are different.
For Laura, I'm wondering, in what ways did your daughter Rose influence you as a writer?
My daughter Rose influencing me as a writer.
Yeah.
Well, Rose was unlike any girl or woman of her time. Manly and I, well, we didn't know what to do with her. She turned my hair gray, what with all of her travels and her adventures and crazy jobs, and then, of course, the divorce. People talk about Fitzgerald and Lewis as being among the literary greats. Nonsense. Let me tell you this. In 1920, my daughter was the highest paid writer in America. When we lost everything in the market crash, it was Rose who told me to write my life story. She had all the right connections I'd need. As it turned out, no one was interested in an adult memoir of a pioneer girl's life. Rose told me to write for children. She was right. A children's series was my ticket. I'd send her my manuscripts and she'd cover it in ink, sending it back to me. More details, more tension, more character development. Cut this, add that. Sometimes I just wanted to throw the whole thing in the fire. I was just done. But I have to tell you, more than once, I was bitterly angry with Rose. She has a very famous novel, Let the Hurricane Roar. That book nearly ended me. If you haven't read it, let me fill you in on the plot. It's about a young couple who homestead on the Minnesota prairie. They live in a dugout on a creek. Their crop is eaten by a swarm of locusts. The man has to walk 100 miles to find work. And there's a very, very long winter. And the woman is out of wood and she has to twist hay into sticks so she doesn't freeze to death. Yes, that's my story, mine. It took me a long time to forgive Rose for that. So perhaps your question should have been, how did Laura Ingalls Wilder influence her daughter Rose as a writer?
sorry if I offended you. We'll move on to Maud. Back to Maud. Maud, when did you know that you wanted to be a writer?
Well, my mother always used to share a story that at the age of 5, I would follow her around and I would ask the question, how do you spell going down the street? So there really, I cannot remember back to a year in which I did not consider myself to be a writer, and the younger I was, the bigger the capital W. I wrote in notebooks and I illustrated them with pictures cut from magazines. And when I was 10, my father, and I hope at not too great of expense to himself, had a book of my earliest rhymes published. Soon after, I started bombarding the magazines and sold my first short story at the age of 18. Prior to writing the Betsy Tacy books, I had written 6 historical novels and many short stories. When I wrote the Betsy Tacy book, the first one, I never planned to write another, but the children wanted more. The Betsy Tacy books have been rewarding to me because through them I've had correspondence with children in every state of the Union. The children always ask me about the characters and then they tell me what to write the next book about. After Betsy's wedding, I was asked to continue the Betsy Tacy series with another story, but I really feel that the last line in Betsy's wedding sums up the series nicely, so you'll have to read the series, get to the last book to find out what it's about.
But then I'll know more. But that sounds smart, Maud. Go out on top, right? Leave with people wanting more.
Absolutely.
That's a good way to think. Sinclair, in 1926, you were awarded the Pulitzer Prize, which is no, small feat, for your novel Aerosmith. You were the first person to decline to accept the award. What was up with that?
Well, I did not agree with contests where one book or author was praised over another. I also objected to the way publishers would advertise a Pulitzer winner as a best novel of the year, as if any committee or person was competent enough to select a best novel. I wrote a lengthy letter to the Pulitzer Prize Committee to explain. Would you mind hearing it?
Go for it.
Wonderful. I wish to acknowledge your choice of my novel, Aerosmith, for the Pulitzer Prize. That prize I must refuse, and my refusal would be meaningless unless I explained the reasons. All prizes, like all titles, are dangerous. The seekers of prizes tend to labor not for inherent excellence, but for an alien rewards. They tend to write this, or timorously to avoid writing that, in order to tickle the prejudices of a haphazard committee. And the Pulitzer Prize for novels in particularly objectionable because the terms of it have been constantly and grievously misrepresented. Those terms are that the prizes shall be given, in quote, for the American novel published during the year which shall best present the wholesome atmosphere of American life and the highest standard of American manners and manhood, end quote. This phrase, if it means anything whatever, would appear to mean that the appraisal of the novels shall be made not according to their actual literary merit, but in obedience to whatever code of good form may chance to be popular at that moment.
Thank you for shedding some light on your decision by reading that letter.
Thank you for listening.
Wanda, I think one of your most popular books among all people is Millions of Cats. Can you just tell us how that came to be published?
Millions of Cats started taking form in my mind in about 1920. At the time, I was a little-known artist, not really known at all. I attempted to get published by New York publishers several times with failure. However, in 1926, I was doing a print show and watercolor show in the Way Gallery in New York, and I happened upon Ernestine Evans, who was an editor with Coward McCann Publishers firm, and she asked me to illustrate an already written book, to update it. However, I told her if it wasn't something that I took hold of me way deep inside, I couldn't do it. It wasn't the way I wanted to illustrate. She heard me and listened, and she asked me if I'd like to write and illustrate my own novel. And in 1928, I published Millions of Cats. It was an overnight success. In fact, it won the Newbery Honor Award in 1929, and it's one of the few picture books to have done so. It's never been out of print since. Another little known fact that most people wonder about when they find out I wrote a book about cats is, did I own cats? And I did. I had 2 cats that the book was inspired by, both in writing and in the illustrations, Snoopy and Snooky.
Thank you. So yes, so you weren't a crazy cat lady. You just had 2 cats.
Only 2 cats, not millions of cats.
We'll move on to F. Scott. We just have one question each for the remainder of our panelists here. So with F. Scott, did you ever feel like you were one of those beautiful people that you wrote about?
Well, I certainly tried to be. I think I always wanted to be a beautiful person. I grew up in the humble Midwest, and so I didn't have much, beautifulness in my life. So you rarely see that in my work, though, about my humble beginnings. I was always searching for more. All my characters leave for fancier, more exotic places, trying to get away. So while all those are fictional characters, each one of them is still Scott Fitzgerald. So when, for instance, when I write about a character leaving humble beginnings, such as my own, and looking for something more, well, that's a part of me. I left St. Paul many times, but St. Paul never really left me. It certainly had its wealthier pockets with its own beautiful people, but I really wasn't a part of that. The people down my block owned lumber mills and paper companies, and while my house looked fancy, it was nothing compared to the mansions on the street. But after my first novel became very successful, This Side of Paradise, Zelda and I got a little taste of hobnobbing, if you will, with the wealthy. We went down to fraternize with the St. Paul elite at the University Club. So after Paradise came out, I vaulted into the strata of becoming famous. I was a classic rock star before the days of pop music and movies. In those days, a writer could be a legitimate star, and I was, I suppose, in that regard, one of the beautiful people. Zelda and I were in all the tabloids. People watched us, and at that time, I was a celebrity with a capital C. But as most famous stories go, most famous people, it quickly flamed out. My success didn't last. I began to have problems with alcohol and fights with Zelda. Then I was no longer looked at as a beautiful person, but rather a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Roaring '20s. A decade where it began with life and lavish, ended with quickly despairing. So at that time, in the end, I didn't feel like a beautiful person anymore.
Thank you for sharing those personal insights. We have one more question as we wrap up this panel, and that question is to Laura. You were the main breadwinner in your family, not something that was happening very often with women in their households. So because you were the main breadwinner, did you feel like a feminist?
Well, let me tell you this. When Manley proposed marriage, I told him 2 things. First, I would not allow the word obey in those marriage vows. I would obey no man against my better judgment. And secondly, I was not interested in the women's vote. I know that may surprise you, but we did get the vote, didn't we? Certainly, I worried that women were not ready for it. We had been careless about educating ourselves. All those years, we didn't have to pay attention to world affairs. We didn't need to understand government. We had no experience in this immense responsibility. That was our husbands, not ours. Then I realized we could no longer hide behind our men. We had to start thinking for ourselves. Now it's our duty to study and learn. Study and learn, especially women of a certain class and character. If we don't take it seriously, women, shall I say, of a lesser class, could harm our country. Women will not necessarily bring more purity to politics. Not any more so than men. Therefore, good women, women who make homes and nurture their families, must take care to make good decisions so we can outweigh the influence of a rougher class of women.
Thank you, that was a great answer. I do want to thank the authors for coming here today and for answering questions about their writing and about Minnesota and other things related to literature. I do want to remind the audience that Maud and Wanda and Laura will be reading from their books in the children's corner of the event center across the hallway. And I also invite you to stay for David Geisner and Pat Bauer if you were interested in historical information and people in historical costume. David and Pat will be doing a historical reenactment as well and inviting audience participation, so feel free to stick around right here in this space. Thank you. Thank the authors.